Well, Friday night. My gosh, we got you back.
I know, right? Well, last week I was back last week, but
Yeah, that's true.
it wasn't quite the same. So yeah, this is great. Our first evidence-based triathlete where we're actually talking about evidence
Yeah,
in a little while.
yeah.
So, I haven't really talked much on the podcast about what happened to me,
Hmm.
but I'll just take a few minutes and just kind of let people know what I went through
Yeah.
and what happened and why I didn't go to Finland and didn't race. And so just briefly, I've struggled for a long time with strictures in my urethra, which sound as horrible as they are. So this a stricture, for those of you that don't know, is basically a narrowing of a tube, and the urethra is a mucous membrane tube. And so I had a few procedures when I was a kid, like when I was 16, 17. And I kind of always knew that I was going to have something else done eventually. And I'd been, my unfortunately my urine flow has not been great for a long time. And then at Escape from Alcatraz, um, I was descending on my bike and I hit a pothole really hard, and my saddle came up and hit me underneath and on my urethra, and my flow went to almost zero.
Mm.
And so, went in to see the urologist, and it's a urologist that I've seen before, and who knew this, this was sort of an issue, but it wasn't bad enough to actually be surgically fixed. And so unfortunately, it's a really rare thing. And there's only a handful of surgeons in the country that do it. And 6 years ago, last time I kind of looked at this, there was no one in Las Vegas that did it. But fortunately, there's someone in Las Vegas that does this now. So my urologist got me in to see him. And this was actually quite an emergent thing because I was on the edge of not being able to pee.
Mm.
And when that happened, I had to stop training.
Yeah.
Um, it was just very, very painful. I couldn't sleep. I was pretty much just dribbling out urine
Hmm.
every 30 minutes to 45 minutes,
Mm.
with a lot of pain.
Yeah.
And so I didn't train for like 4 weeks. Then I had surgery. Now it's 4 weeks ago I had surgery, and they did something called a erythroplasty, which basically means remaking the urethra.
Hmm.
And so I had the surgery, and that was 4 weeks ago. I was catheterized for 3 weeks, so on the couch and in bed for 3 weeks.
Mm.
And just so people can kind of understand, I have a 3-inch incision, basically right where you sit on the saddle,
All right.
and and it was relatively deep. The surgery was like 3.5 hour long surgery, so it was quite invasive. And so anyways, last week I got the catheter out, and they tested kind of how it is, and my flow is great. I'm peeing like a
Hmm.
a prepubescent boy. And so obviously I couldn't train, I couldn't do anything. And
You
I
couldn't podcast.
couldn't podcast. I
Yeah.
mean, honestly, I couldn't. And still today, like just sitting and being like finding comfort, and even still like sleeping, like it's not a comfortable situation,
Hmm.
even still. But the good news is today was the first day that I was allowed to swim.
I
And
saw that on Strava.
yeah, I was so excited to go for a swim. I did 1,000. It was horrible. I pulled the entire way because
Yeah.
even like just kicking
Yeah.
is still not good. Um, but I'm on the road to recovery
Hmm.
and feeling good about things. Originally, part of the reason I kind of put off like getting it fixed for a long time was my urologist, and what I originally was reading was like they said maybe 8 months off of the bike.
Mm.
And I was like, oh my gosh, I can't live like with that. But then I couldn't live with the other situation either.
Hmm.
And then when I met with the surgeon, he was like, yeah, it's more like 2 months off the bike. I'm like, okay, I can deal with that.
Hmm.
And then at the last meeting, he's like, well, the surgery went so good and your results are so good that probably only 6 weeks off of the bike from the
Yeah.
surgery date.
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh my gosh, like my eyes lit up. But then it's been now 4 weeks. I'm like, I can't even imagine sitting
Mm.
on a bike. But
Hmm.
he's like, yeah, it'll be safe to do. But he's like, but you have to be comfortable to do it. So I'm still thinking it's going to be a while till
Yeah.
I can get biking, and even running seems like a long way off. But getting in and actually swimming was awesome.
That's great.
And you don't realize how much you miss stuff until you
Mhm.
it gets taken away from you. So anyways, that's my story.
Yep.
I'm back podcasting. I'm back to work next week. Um, so yeah, life continues to move on. And
Yep.
now I'm thinking, John, like, hey, what are we doing for triathlon next year? We got lots of big races on the calendar, and hopefully we're going to go to Japan and
Yeah,
maybe
that's
New
right.
Zealand, and
We got plans.
we got plans. Next year's a
Hey,
big year.
yeah, right. Well,
And
a few lessons that I've learned as you've gone through this is one, we've got to pay attention to how we're feeling. And sometimes when things aren't feeling right, wherever that not right is, you got to follow through. And I really, congratulate you for diving into the health services to try to figure out what's going on.
yeah,
And I think far too many people do try to sort of work through whatever the pain is. And a lot of times, whatever that signal is, that means something needs to be taken care of. And so that I thought was really good how you dove right in. Big decisions because it really influenced what you were doing for fun.
yeah,
You obviously had to cancel the trip to Lati, which you qualified for that race, what, 3 years ago now, or
yeah, 4 years ago.
4 years ago? Yeah. So that race was in the works really for obviously some time, and just that's a big decision. But I think the other big message that I've seen is you've got to be in good shape when you go in for surgery,
Yeah,
and you were in great shape.
yeah.
And obviously, you lose some of that fitness, as you go through this rest period and recovery period. And that's why if you can work your fitness up before a big surgery like this, that's really important. And so I think that's another good take home. And I think once you start back, it'll be, you'll be smart about it and gradually build it back up.
Well, the good news is I'm not in a hurry. Like,
Hmm.
I really am not. Like,
Yeah,
and
yeah,
we've talked about this before. You and I both have been kind of to the mountaintop in triathlon.
yeah,
Like,
right.
I've accomplished pretty much everything I want to accomplish in triathlon.
Hmm.
Like, really, like I have. And now, like, I want to get back and do well. Um, but it's not like I have this need. Oh my gosh, I've got a race in December and I got to crush it.
Hmm.
That's not like, for me. It's like, looking to next spring
Hmm.
and St. George in
Hmm.
particular, like I'd really like to go to St. George, do well, qualify for New Zealand.
Hmm.
And I don't see any reason why not. Like, I've coached enough people from nothing
Yeah,
to pretty high
right,
level in 8 months. I'm
right.
looking at 8 months to go from a pretty good level to you
Hmm.
know to there. So I don't see any reason why I can't. And like I said, I'm gonna be smart about it. I'm gonna take my time.
Yeah.
I'm going to Another thing I'm gonna do is I've always dabbled in strength training,
Hmm.
but I'm gonna put more of an emphasis on strength training while I can't put as
Yeah.
many hours on the bike, and as many hours running. So I've got a plan in place. Yeah, it's gonna be honestly, John, my life already is so much better.
Yeah. Right.
Like even though this has been hard, like I don't know, like, it's already better. And
Well,
the other thing I'll just add really quickly is part of the fear of the whole thing was almost like an embarrassment. It's your urethra, like it's your
mhm,
penis. And we as a society just don't do a good job of talking about
yeah,
things. And like
mhm,
we've talked about in the past, even with females and menstruation, uh and even females, sitting on the saddle and having, irritation in their labia, and those, it's just anatomy.
yeah,
And we've, as people of science, you and I,
mhm,
need to get past that. And
right,
that's, so when people ask me what's going on, I never shied away from saying what it was, right? Like, but a couple of years ago, I was more shy about it. But I'm
yeah,
like, I
sure,
gotta own this. That as me, I'm a medical professional as well, right? Like,
mhm,
I've got to be able to talk about these things. And it's interesting. Like, I teach about scrotal injuries and testicular injuries and all this
yeah,
in class, and my students, they kind of sometimes giggle or whatever. I'm like, hey, this is just another piece of anatomy.
that's right, Right.
And so that's been it's been a good thing for me as well to just be very open
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
about this.
Oh, that's good. And it is great to have you back. We've missed you. I've missed you on the podcast. You know, it's great to have Jim Martin as our
Yeah.
guest co-host and to call upon him, and that was fun. But it is it's nice to have the routine you and I have with this podcast, and so it's nice to have you back and
Awesome.
getting this going again.
So next week we're going to talk about the psychology of loss when we can't
Hmm.
race and we want to race because of medical stuff or other things. But today we're going to talk about cycling.
Yeah,
We're going to get back to our roots, John.
that's
Uh,
right.
I think if we were to add it up, we would probably have talked more about cycling than any any other thing. But remember, in a triathlon, that's the most amount of time that
Yeah,
you're going to spend.
yeah.
So we're going to talk about cycling, but we're going to talk about cycling up hills.
Hmm.
So you and I are very fortunate. We live in a hilly place.
Yeah. You can train in
Yes,
Vegas. You can race anywhere.
exactly. But it's so funny, right? Like if you talk to people from other places, they, oh, we're lucky we don't have any
Yeah, yeah.
hills.
Right, right.
But I think we're lucky because we have hills.
Oh, totally. Yeah.
But the thing with it is there is good ways to climb hills
Hmm.
and not so good ways to climb hills. There's a technique to climbing hills.
Hmm.
Some of the technique is actually, it's really interesting. It's still the science is still not settled.
Yeah.
Like, should you stand? Should you sit?
Right.
How much should you sway? Where should your hands be? Where should your body weight be? Where should the power phase be? Should you dorsiflex? Should you plantar flex in your ankle? There's a lot of things that are still opinion
Hmm.
that aren't science. Now you sent me an article. It was from 2008, was it? Yeah, 2008.
Yes. Yep. Hmm.
So it's it's like a 15-year-old article, but this was one of the first articles that actually looked at like EMG levels of different muscles when we stand versus sit.
Hmm.
And so we've both talked about this before. You're a stander when
Yeah.
you
Yeah.
climb. I like to stand when I climb. Um, but there's definitely some science behind why you should stand and when you should stand. And
Mhm.
so today we're going to get into that.
Yep. I love it. And it's timely because Ironman World Championship for men is in Nice,
Yep.
and that bike ride has about 8,000 feet of climbing, which for us, that's a typical, ride around here is 8,000 feet. So
Well, 8,000 is still a lot. I
it
mean,
is. Yeah.
I was thinking about that, when I go and climb Mount Charleston from the base, and
Hmm.
then it takes all day, it's still only 6,000 feet.
Yeah. Yeah. Right. Right.
And that's a lot. I mean, that's
Yeah,
3 hours of
8,000
climbing.
is a good amount of climbing, but it's not hard to accumulate that when you do a century ride
No.
around here.
Yeah, a century ride around here, you can
Yeah,
easily do that.
yeah.
So that being said, one of the things that we should be aspiring towards is to be better at climbing.
Hmm.
Now, there's a couple philosophies behind this, right? Is should we just go do it, right? Just let nature take its course, or should we work actually on technique for climbing? So what do you do, John?
Well, let me even back up a little bit further because when we start talking about going to races with a lot of climbing, the other decision in terms of, which way to climb is which bike do you take? Now, some of us only have one bike that we want to race on,
Yeah.
and you're going to take your time trial bike, your triathlon bike. But some people have a choice and they may want to choose a road bike over a triathlon bike. This study was done, like you said, back in 2008. They only looked at road bikes,
Yeah.
but we can learn a lot from that. And actually, some of the information they went over actually sort of points to there are some advantages to a triathlon bike when
Yes.
biking uphill. But, if I've got a hilly course that I know I'm going to do, and I want to do well in that course, I do go practice climbing hills. And
Yep.
so I'll do a route that includes, roughly 3,000 feet of climbing for like a 60-mile route. And that is sort of a good number to where you get some good climbing, but it doesn't lengthen the ride too much. Because one of
Yep.
the problems with a lot of climbing is the ride just takes longer. So it's you.
Well, and
Yep.
especially if you're one of those people that really is concerned about getting the miles in,
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
right?
Right.
Like I know a lot of cyclists. Well, how many miles did you get this week? Well, when I was doing my Everesting,
Yeah.
and I was doing like, 10,000-foot days, I
Hmm.
wasn't getting that many miles in.
Right, right.
I was getting a lot of hours in,
Yeah.
but not a lot of miles in. So you're absolutely right.
Yeah.
Like it takes longer.
Right. And it takes longer because you don't make up the time that you lose as you go uphill. It doesn't just, it doesn't average out,
Yeah.
or it averages out on the slow side, if you will. So, those people who are in the flat world, and they do a 60-mile ride, it may only take them whatever, 3.5, 4 hours. But once you start adding in some climbing, that could add on 30 minutes, 45 minutes, maybe even an hour, even though you're going up and downhill and have no net gain. So I do think there is a lot of practice. It is a skill, and I think this paper, to me, I walked away really thinking that climbing is a skill set that you need to have in your biking repertoire, and not only a skill set in terms of what's happening with the lower body, but what's happening with the upper body. Because was another one of the first studies that looked at upper body muscle activity while climbing, as opposed to just looking at the lower body.
No, you're exactly right. And the other thing that I wanted to kind of to delve into is that, and I don't think that everyone thinks about the biomechanics of this like you and I do. Right?
Hmm.
When you change body position, you change how muscles work,
Yeah.
right? So by just changing to go uphill compared to riding on the flat,
Hmm.
your center of gravity changes
Yeah.
and your body position tends to change. We actually tend to sit up more
Hmm.
when we go uphill. There's some people that call it the stair climber effect. Like you actually turn into like a stair climber where you're really stood up straight and and that changes things,
Hmm.
right? And,
Hmm.
and and changes things probably mostly in the biggest muscle or the strongest muscle of the body, the gluteus maximus.
Hmm.
When we sit up straight, we kind of turn off the gluteus maximus a little bit. If we bend forward, we turn it on more. So now I love the fact you alluded to that a time trial bike may actually be better for climbing.
Right.
And it's because of the gluteus maximus. Is that
Yeah.
where you were going on that?
Yeah, a little bit. And they were also talking about if you have a forward saddle on the road bike, that's advantageous for
Right.
climbing versus a saddle that's back. And obviously, with a, well, not obvious, a lot of people don't know this. A triathlon bike, your saddle is most likely going to be more forward than you would have on a road bike.
And because your handlebars are lower,
Yeah.
right? So where you're going to be grabbing on the bull horns, right? Because we're not going to be usually an arrow as we climb,
Right.
right? Most people go to like the bull horns. That's significantly lower than on a road bike where you'd be on the hoods.
Hmm. Hmm.
And because of that, you're going to gain hip flexion.
Hmm.
And it's kind of like one of the things you'll notice if you ever watch like pro cycling, a lot of times you see climbing, especially when they're going hard, they're in the drops. So they're in the lower part of the
Hmm.
handlebars. And once again, the reason is to basically increase the tension on the gluteus maximus, which will increase its force production.
Hmm.
And also actually, yeah. So that's that. Anyways, mechanics change.
Yeah.
And so one of the things that if I was coaching somebody on like hill climbing, I'd say, hey, listen, like what you need to do is change positions,
Hmm.
spend sometime lower, you know, on the handlebar. Sometimes when I climb, I'm a little bit lazy and I put my hands on my arrow pads,
Hmm. Hmm.
right?
Yeah.
That's a more sat up position.
Yeah.
But we do that because the muscles are fatigued in different ways. So you
Hmm.
can't stay low the entire time because your muscles maybe going to fatigue more, or I don't have the flexibility to do it.
Right. Right.
So that's another reason that you need to have flexibility to actually be able to climb. And people don't recognize this. It's like
Yeah.
it's actually a really important thing. Is overall just having good. It's not really flexibility, but mobility.
Yeah. So so I love this. So we're going to sort of bookend this. So there is some training and it's a skill set. And I really liked what you just said, that you've got to try different positions and practice different positions because they're all a little bit different. And in essence, that's what this paper ends up saying is, oh, the answer in terms of what's the best way to climb uphill. It's like, well, it sort of depends. And you sort of you gotta practice all these different ways So it seems unsatisfying to get that answer, but it's also, I think, really important to recognize that everything changes as you go uphill and as you change where your hands are and what position you're going to be on the bike, whether you're an arrow or on the bars in either place. So the paper we looked at was actually a pretty long title. So muscular activity during uphill cycling, effect of slope, posture, hand grip position, and constrained bicycle lateral sway. And that's the other part that I really want to tap
I
into.
want to get into this way too. Yeah.
Yeah, because I've got a doc student who's actually looking at how we sway side to side while we bike, and I really like this study for that reason too. In this study, they had everyone cycle at in essence 80% VO2 max. That was the target intensity, and that's an important part of this paper is that every stage that they did was the same intensity in that sense. And they looked at three slopes, 4, 7, and 10%. So some pretty good grades.
Yep.
Yeah. So 10%, where do you see
10%.
10%?
In Las Vegas, there's a very few spots.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the steepest part of the Red Rock Loop climb, like I think it's mile like 3.5
Hmm.
ish. There's a small section that might be 10%.
Yeah.
But other than that, there might be some short little roads.
Yeah.
We have no sustained climbs at 10%. And
No.
and trust me, I looked because when I did my Everest thing, I
Yeah.
was trying to find the steepest part,
Yeah.
place to ride. There are very few places. Like the Three Sisters
Yeah.
on your side of town,
Yeah. That's true.
the
Right.
steepest sections are probably 10 to
Hmm.
12%.
Yeah.
So we're talking like 10% is a good grade. And I know sometimes when
It's,
you watch like cycling on TV, like, oh, it's 20%.
hmm.
You've probably never ridden up
Hmm.
20%. I mean, I found a good climb in California once that was 20%, and it scared the heck out of me.
Yeah. Yeah. Right.
Like even at like 350 watts, I was not moving,
Yeah. Yeah.
like 20% is
I did
almost impossible.
death ride up in Tahoe, and one of the grades was 12%, and that is steep.
It
So
is
that
steep.
is, down at the on Lake Mead side, coming out of Boulder Beach, that gets close to 8% near the end, but it's not even that. The 8%, there is a sign for 8% grade as you exit the park on the on North Shore Boulevard. But even 8% is not a grade that's easy to find around here.
Yeah.
So 10% is a lot. That's a steep hill.
Yeah.
4% is pretty typical for a lot of the climbs, and 4% that's still a serious climb. That's not,
Yeah.
that's nothing to laugh off. So
The other thing I'm going to add before you keep summarizing this is 80% of VO2 max is a good solid
yeah.
hit.
Mm-hmm.
VO2 max is like that's the top end of your aerobic ability, right?
Right.
That's so 80% is, and because I'm trying to think, my VO2 max power when I last time we looked at it was, I think it was like 350 watts or something like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
80% of 350, I'm still looking at 275 watts. Like
Mm-hmm.
it's no joke.
Yeah.
Like this,
Right.
this was not like these people, like some people say, oh, 80%, that's not that hard.
Mm-hmm.
80% of your VO2 max is hard.
Yeah.
It's probably close to your FTP.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah.
Maybe even a little bit above
Yep.
that. So they looked at the three slopes. They looked at two hand grip positions. Now they were using road bikes, so they did on the brake levers of the road bike and on the drops. So triathletes may not know, but you've got that handlebar that loops around on a road bike, and the drops are that bottom part that you're holding onto. And I would think that a lot of people's base bar on a tri bike would likely be similar to the drops more so than the brake levers.
Yeah.
And then they also looked at allowing people to sway side to side on their bike and then also blocking them, preventing that sway side by side, which is pretty cool. I actually had to look and see how they did this. They did all their testing on a treadmill,
Right.
a big treadmill.
Bicycle treadmill.
And I'm like, oh, that would be so cool to have a big treadmill to ride on, because that's a great way to simulate
Yeah.
riding. And then you can do a lot of your measurements like a VO2 and Empower and EMG. You can do them in the lab much better than you can do outside. And doing this study on a fixed trainer, and this is partly what they actually showed, is it would yield different results than if you allow people to ride freely and let some of that natural sway happen. So what are some of your take-home points from this one?
Well, and I'd like to add really quickly. So most of us that ride on trainers don't have any sway,
Right. Hmm.
right? And it's actually one of the things that I'm kind of interested in after reading through the paper, um, is that if I only train on a trainer and then I go out and want to do hill climbing in a race,
Yeah.
I haven't trained that,
Hmm.
right? And one of the things I was really thinking about, especially if I'm standing, right? Because when you stand, the sway is so much more important.
Yeah.
And for
Right.
people that don't know what sway is, that's like when the bike is moving under you side to side,
Hmm.
right? So even when I stand on my trainer, so if I'm in a race or I stand up and I get extra power, which I can, there's no sway.
Right.
And so I'm losing actually power potentially by not having that sway. So one of the things that I would, think that would be important is if you spend a lot of time on the trainer is to get out and actually get on some hills
Hmm.
and practice the actual sway. So for me, like the take homes were that the hand position does matter,
Hmm.
that it affects things differently,
Right.
that obviously saddle position matters. That once again, if we put the gluteus maximus in an advantageous position, it's better,
Hmm.
right? Which makes sense. And so that actually how you ride does matter.
Yeah.
Like it's not just about like when we kind of like take this all together, it's not just about going out and hammering watts.
Hmm. Hmm.
Like you know, there's a nuance to this.
Yeah.
And if you figure out the nuances within yourself, where, and you could do like the other thing I was kind of taking away after I read this, like, okay, I should do a test, like do a 1 mile climb with my hands in this position, put out this much power, or the hands in this position, put out this much power, and then look at the physiology behind, like, well, what does my heart rate do?
Hmm.
Right. And I think that those are like, if you want to be kind of on the cutting edge of stuff, I think those are important things to look at. Those are my take
No,
homes.
I love it. And actually, I forgot to add in the other conditions that they had was seated and climb or seated
Yeah.
and standing. I'm sorry, like that was the obvious one that we pulled this paper for.
Yeah.
And so they did all these different conditions. And I was really impressed that the slope itself did not change things dramatically, but the hand position and whether or not you were standing or seating had a big influence on muscle activity. Obviously, standing and seating, you can see how muscles would be different there. But in essence, the take home message was position on the bike was almost a bigger factor
Yep.
than the actual slope that you were biking up. And
Exactly.
sort of the aha moment was, okay, if you're sitting and you're biking up a 4, 7, or 10%, you're still going to recruit the muscles similar,
Right.
but if you change your hand position, it's going to be different.
Yeah.
Or if you change and get out of your saddle, it's going to be really different at that point. And so by changing the position, you can do these subtle micro adjustments of how the muscles are being recruited. And that may actually be a good strategy when you're going up a sustained climb. Because if you do it the same way for whatever, a 5 mile climb, you may actually be fatiguing certain muscles by the time that you get done with that ride. But if you do these micro adjustments of hand position, or if you do seated versus standing, you can recruit muscles differently and maybe extend out and minimize that fatigue going up that long climb.
No, and it's funny because when we start talking about this, because we've talked about this a lot, the standing versus sitting.
Yeah.
And so I'm somebody that like I'll stand and then sit and then stand and then sit.
Hmm.
Um, there's one climb I really like to do at Mount Charleston, and every mile marker, I make sure to stand back up, and I'll stand for like a minute,
Yeah.
and then I'll sit down the next mile marker, or whatever it is, I'll stand again.
Hmm.
And once again, it's just for training, it's to train the different
Hmm.
positions.
Yeah.
Now, the hand position is super interesting, right? Because what hand position does is it changes trunk position.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's not the hands aren't any,
Great, great.
that's not the magic. It's what happens at the hips,
Hmm.
at the actual hip joints. So one of the things that after I read the paper and I went obviously deeper into some stuff, and looked at some other like professional cycling coaches, and what they were recommending is not just hand position, but elbow position.
Mm,
So once you have that, everyone knows that now, like hand position is better when you're in the drops for
right.
climbing, right? But if your elbows are straight, you don't engage the glutes as much. So they
Mm-hmm.
are, basically they're saying, hey, listen, you want your elbows to be more bent,
Mm-hmm.
up to like 60, 70 degrees of elbow bend. So some people will be in the drops, but they'll have their elbows completely extended,
Right, right,
right?
right.
So if you're in the drops and you bend your elbows, once again, that is going to engage your glute more. And
Yeah.
then thinking about like that pelvic rotation where you're rotating your pelvis forward, once again, is elongating the glutes, it's elongating the hamstrings
Mm-hmm.
and making them both more active
Yeah.
uh, as you climb. So that's kind of like the next step, is not just the hands, but what's happening at the elbows.
No, I love that because actually these authors did talk about the potential influence of cycling experience
Yeah.
and whether or not you take an elite athlete and compare how they respond to these different conditions versus someone who's a novice rider. And there is a level of experience that probably does come into play with these different techniques.
Yeah. And once again, like if you take somebody that's a flatlander, right? They're living in, I don't know, North Dakota, and
Mhm.
everything is relatively flat, and they come to St. George for a race
Yeah.
and they haven't experienced a lot of climbing,
Hmm.
they're not going to be as efficient of a cyclist on the climb up. And and we've talked about this before, not going to be as experienced in the descent either at 40 miles an hour with a
Yeah.
crosswind,
Right.
right? They're potentially going to be more nervous about that. So once again, it comes down to practice, but also practice once again with understanding these mechanics
Hmm. Hmm.
and utilizing the mechanics.
Yeah.
Um, so John, what happens? Do you know actually what happens physiologically to your heart and lungs if you stand versus sit?
I should have looked that up. I should have looked at and I'm glad you mentioned that because in this paper, they controlled VO2.
Right,
And so that's what we don't know is what if you let them self-select an
exactly.
intensity or a pace going up these different and doing these different conditions. So that's an important part. In this study, VO2 was exactly the same for every condition.
So there is research on this.
Yeah, what did you find?
So if you stand, it becomes more of a muscular thing. So
Hmm.
more of it's all aerobic,
Yeah.
right? But more of a muscular endurance thing. So you actually lower your heart rate when you
Hmm.
stand, which
Hmm.
is kind of counterintuitive. You think when you're standing, I'm working harder,
Right.
but it becomes more of a muscular thing.
Hmm.
Whereas if you're seated, it's less of a muscular thing. It's
Hmm.
more of an aerobic thing. So that's something that some coaches are actually talking about is okay, like if we're doing like heart rate training, might be best if I wanted to keep the heart rate a little lower to stand some.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Or this is something that I found this was some pro cycling coaches talking about this. If you're in a race and you're at your cardiovascular limit
Hmm.
and somebody attacks, standing up will allow you to drop your cardiovascular input. Now the trick is you can only do it for some certain amount of time, right?
Right,
Because once
right.
you go more muscular, you're going to kind of burn out your muscles a little bit more.
Hmm.
And then I
Hmm.
was thinking about, okay, well, as a triathlete, lowering my heart rate might be good, but then utilizing my muscular strength might not be so good. So maybe we should be, once again, like you and I do it, where we stand, but we kind of limit it.
Yeah. No, I love that. And that actually makes perfect sense. Now, from a mechanical perspective, this is where power, you've heard me refer to power as really describing how fast we're transforming energy from one state to the other.
Yep.
If we're seated on the bike, and this is why when you do a bike test for even a graded exercise test, you want to stay seated the whole time. You don't want to come out of the saddle for that. But if you're seated, the idea is that the power that the bike is registering is going to be the same as the aerobic power, which represents how fast we're transforming chemical potential energy to mechanical energy, in essence. There's some
Yeah.
steps in there that sort of mess up that interpretation, but that's what the broad brush explanation is we're taking that energy in glucose, we're taking it in the carbohydrates and the fats, and we're transforming that aerobically using oxygen to the ability to for muscles to shorten and generate a force. So the trick is or an interesting part of standing is not only do you have chemical potential energy that you're allowing to transform to mechanical energy, you've got potential energy to position.
Yeah.
And
And
so
that's
now you can use your weight to actually help move the pedals, and that is not a cardiovascular transformation of energy. It is just the pure fact that you have weight on the pedal. That's actually going to help move that pedal downward. And so now you've got chemical potential energy and you've got potential energy due to position that is transformed into, in essence, kinetic energy. So,
especially if you're swaying the bike appropriately, right?
oh, yeah, yeah, yeah,
If you figure out the timing between
right.
your stroke and when you
Right.
sway the bike, which you can do over time,
Hmm.
you can get more of that potential energy into
Yeah,
kinetic energy.
yeah,
And yes, so anyways, that was one of the big take homes. And then learning how to and when to straighten your leg. So
yeah,
most
yeah,
people straighten their leg too late.
yeah.
If you straighten your leg a little bit sooner, you actually get more of that potential energy, and you can
Hmm.
actually lower your heart rate. Uh,
Hmm.
super cool stuff, right?
Yeah. No, I love it. And I'm glad you brought the sway back in because that was one of the things that they tested in this study was either blocking the bike from swaying or allowing it to sway. And that sway has an influence on the outcome of the study. And so they actually were justifying why my doc student, Alina Swafford, is doing her PhD dissertation on looking at muscle activity with the ability to sway and the ability not to sway. So the board is the way it's set up. You won't be able to go side to side or just whatever the flex is in the slop in the system.
So she's measuring electrical activity in muscles, right?
Yeah, yeah. And well, she's going to focus in on physiology mostly at this point.
Oh, she's not doing EMG.
No,
Sorry, I
no,
don't know. I don't know her study, because one of the things that they were also talking about, and some of the deeper stuff I was getting into, was looking at engagement of the lats
mm-hmm,
and
mm,
engagement of
interesting.
the biceps
Yeah,
as
yeah,
you're standing, right? So you're actually getting power that's turning basically this potential into kinetic that's coming from muscles that you don't really care much about,
yeah,
right? Like
right.
for me as a triathlete,
Mm-hmm,
my lats I'm going to use when I'm swimming, and my biceps I'm going to use some when I'm swimming. But after that, I don't care. I could
yeah,
burn those suckers out
right, right.
because I'm not going to need them to run,
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm,
right? And so utilizing some of these other really large muscles, especially the lats. I mean,
mm-hmm,
for most triathletes, their lats are the latissimus dorsi are extremely
yeah,
strong.
mm-hmm,
And so when we're standing, we actually use more of them. And part of the thing, and we haven't talked about this yet, is when we cycle, they talk about the 5 points of contact, right?
mm-hmm,
We've
mm-hmm,
talked about this before. The two pedals, two places your hands are, and your saddle.
right.
Well, what happens when you take away one of those points of contact?
Mm-hmm.
You're going to actually have less stability within the system,
Right.
right? The stability changes. And so then there's a downside of that is
Mm-hmm.
you're actually having to use more core stabilization when you're standing,
Right.
right? And so once again, you got to practice it. Uh,
Mm-hmm.
there's some people that I've talked to and even coached that don't stand.
Oh yeah, yeah.
They just don't.
Yeah, right, right.
And I'm like, you have to learn how to stand.
Yeah, right.
Part of the reason
It's a
is because
weapon in your toolbox.
it's another weapon.
Yeah.
And once again, you have to learn how the core stabilization
Mm-hmm.
works. And once again, you can get more power. You can get more power, especially for short amounts of time. Like one of the little tricks you'll notice is like if you ever do a group ride with good cyclists, every little climb, they all stand up.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Well, they stand up because they get more power,
Mm-hmm.
and you get more power for short amounts of time. They don't stand for miles and miles and miles, most of them. But anyways, yeah, it's a known trick, right? So once again, getting comfortable with this is important.
Yeah, no, totally. And I like that because in this paper, when they looked at allowing people to sway versus not sway, the how active the muscles were actually went down.
Yep.
And so even though the bike is moving more, there was less muscle activity because now it's a coordination issue and you're not forced to pedal and maintain just a vertical bike. It really, it's an interesting phenomenon. So that
Yep.
dynamic stability of the bike actually leads to a less need for muscles to be as active.
So then the question is, do you have a sway board for your indoor trainer?
Yeah, yeah. So I don't, but in the lab we do. We've got
Right.
one. We've got a rocker board in there, so it allows that side to side movement. But
So
I
you
don't
don't have one at home?
know. But my I guess I got a lot of slop on the system because there is some side to side movement on it. I don't have
Yeah.
the
See,
feet all the way down.
I'm on pretty thick carpet. It's just right behind me.
Yeah,
It's got a pretty thick pad in
there you
it,
go.
and then I have a carpet on the carpet.
Yeah, yeah,
So I got a lot of movement.
yeah.
The one thing that I did do, and it's right there, is I bought a kicker
Yep.
climb.
Mm-hmm.
And so it changes the gradient.
Right.
And I found that to be a game changer for me personally.
Yep.
Like
Right.
it was expensive, and I was like, and for years I didn't have one. I'm like, you know what? I need to change position because
Mm-hmm.
it's good for me, right?
Yeah.
If you're just on your, especially on your trainer, and you're always stuck at flat,
Mm-hmm.
or some people they do risers, right?
Right.
They just put a riser in, and like the whole climb is at 5% or
Mm-hmm.
3%. Or I think the variation is pretty cool to be able to do with a kicker climb. So
I love
I'm
that.
not getting paid for them by
I,
them, and there's other companies that make them. But
well,
I
but
recommend them.
based on this paper, what's really cool is you can even add in some more variation for your climbing workouts. Is not only let the slope influence things, but then halfway through your climb, change your hand
Change
position.
your hand position. I do it all the time. I
Yeah,
go,
yeah,
even on my time trial bike, I go from once
yeah.
again the pads
Mm-hmm.
to sometimes even like just on the base bar, and then
Right,
sometimes my hands forward.
right, right.
And I think that's a really important thing to
No,
do, because once again,
no.
you're changing the engagement.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And then shift forward is the other thing that
Yep.
you can do. And again, like you talked about, you could do that by changing your elbow angle, or you can just slide forward as well. So yeah,
Yep.
no, there's some neat things to mix it up, and mixing up is probably a good thing. It's the same thing when we talk about running. I think there's a lot of advantage to running on road, running on sidewalks. I know people say avoid that, but I think then add in running on grass, running on dirt, running on a variety, run uphill, run downhill, run in a variety of situations, and let your body learn these skills of running on these different surfaces. This is the same thing. It's just a subtle change from hand position from on the hoods to down on the drops. You're using muscles differently.
I'm also big with the climbing of changing cadences when I climb.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Is do, some at 60, some at 70, some at 80, some at 90. Once again, the variety
Hmm.
and learning, you're teaching your body how to be efficient at multiple cadences. So one of the things that actually happens is in this, the perfect example is at Snow Canyon in
Yeah,
St.
I
John,
was just thinking of Snow Canyon on
right?
that one.
So that top part is about 10%,
Yeah, yeah.
right? Well, I don't know about you, but my gearing, I can't do 80 cadence,
Yeah. Hmm.
right? Just I could change my gearing, but I know that I'm going to be grinding that 1 mile, right? So I'll probably be at 60 cadence.
Hmm.
So when things get steep and you run out of gears, your cadence goes down.
Hmm.
And so you got to practice it,
Right.
you know. So I'm a believer we've talked about self-selected cadence and the most efficient cadence, and it's
Yeah.
self-selected, but there'll be times when you can't self-select,
No, right.
where the grade and your gearing dictates your cadence.
Hmm. Yeah, it's funny actually. When you just started telling that story, I was thinking the worst situation in climbing is where you've run out of gears, and then you look ahead and you're like, "That's getting steeper,"
Yes.
and that's what Snow Canyon is.
Yeah,
It's
just keep
it's
getting
a good
steeper.
it's a good climb, and then all of a sudden that last whatever half mile or mile, you look up and it's like, "Oh, we got a little bit more hill here."
Yeah, you'd almost rather it all be trees so you couldn't see that it's going to get worse.
Yeah, yeah, right, right, right. Oh,
but but it's interesting that we talk about this. So and I'm going to be a little devil's advocate here, because
hmm.
I like to say controversial things. So we talk about all this change,
Hmm.
right? And change being good. Cyclists and triathletes are notorious for having to have the exact right bike position,
Sure, that's right.
right? Oh, if my saddle is a millimeter off, I can't ride. Like my
Hmm.
knees are going to. I'm wondering. That'd just be an interesting little study, John. Since we're talking
Hmm.
about evidence-based traveling, if we took a cyclist and every time they rode, we change their position a little bit
Right, right.
if they'd be a better cyclist,
Mm-hmm.
rather than like sticking them like you have to be at this exact position
Yeah,
to the millimeter everywhere.
yeah.
I wonder if we're actually hurting people rather than helping people.
No,
I,
I love that. And I tell you, that's why I actually think when you train in Vegas, you can race anywhere because you're always changing position. You're always doing something a little bit different. And this study speaks to that, that even, changing hand position from the drops to the hoods, that's not a big change, but it's changing how muscles are being recruited. But if you go the other direction and you say, I'm only going to ride on a track that's perfectly smooth and I'm going to stay in one position, you'll get really good at riding in that position, but
yeah,
you won't have that flexibility to handle other situations. And you also run into a problem of overuse injuries because now if you keep doing things the same way every cadence, thousands of times that you're going through revolutions of movement. And if it's done the same exact way, you're going to likely get an injury at some point.
yeah, yeah. It's one of those things that's interesting too when people buy a new bike and like, oh, they look so much at, I've got to make sure the exact geometry of my bike
Yeah,
once
right.
again. But and I get it, because if they change now, if they've done, I don't know, 10,000 hours on
Yeah,
this
right.
exact position and then you change,
Mm-hmm.
that is a recipe for disaster.
Mm-hmm. Or going from riding your tri bike to then
Yep,
say, oh, I'm going to just start riding my mountain bike.
yep,
And everything's different, in position, cranks, everything's different. That's a big jump to go that way. But if you have this flexibility and skill set, these tools in your toolbox, I think making that jump to a different type of a bike and different type of geometry is going to be easier.
yep. No, and we've talked about that before. Like, I'm a big fan. Like, if I get someone I coach and they say, what I'd like to do is I want a mountain bike once a week.
Hmm.
Okay, good, do it. I think that's a big positive.
Right, right.
But that same athlete will be worried about 1 millimeter change on their seat
Yeah,
position
right,
on their bike. I'm like, well, you just changed
yeah.
like night and day and you were fine. So your 1 millimeter change on your 2 millimeter change on your triathlon bike is not
Yeah.
going to destroy you.
No, totally. And you're right because we do get neurotic about those things, but then we train in bike shorts
Yeah.
and then we race in tri shorts.
Yeah.
And the tri shorts has a much thinner pad. And back in the day, we'd race in Speedo, where it had no pad.
Yep.
And I mean, you're talking a thick pad for bike shorts to no pad. You're changing multiple millimeters at that point in terms of your reach to the pedals.
Yeah. Exactly. No, yeah, I agree. And so, one of the things I'm thinking about, like, as I come back to racing is like, I'm going to be on my road bike for a while
Yeah,
because
yeah,
just the pressure and stuff like that. And
hmm,
I'm okay with that.
yeah,
Like, I prefer to ride my time trial bike. I really do.
hmm,
But I'm not worried about like, a couple of months on the road bike,
yeah,
like, and then transitioning and, and it's interesting. We talked about that, you used to commute a lot. I used to commute
hmm,
a lot. I always commuted on my road bike,
yeah, hmm.
and I was
I always
really,
commute on my tri bike.
yes, there you go. But and part of the reason was for me, it's just, you know, I'm a little bit better handling on my road bike. The
Yeah,
brakes
yeah,
are braking
yeah,
is just a little bit better. And just
yeah,
for me, it's a little bit more safer. Sitting up a little bit higher
yeah,
might
yeah.
be a little bit safer. But there were, don't get me wrong, like around a race time, I still would commute on my tri bike.
Hmm, hmm.
I think it's good to have a road bike and
Yeah.
a tri bike, and same like with the climbing. So,
Hmm.
okay, John, before we go, let's get into this talk about climbing on your triathlon bike, and I know we've kind of danced
Oh,
around it because Nice is going to be, it's tomorrow night, right?
yeah,
Like
yeah,
whatever.
yeah.
I don't even know what time it's going to start. I'm going to watch the replay. I'm not going to not
Hmm.
going to watch it live.
Yeah, right.
But there will be people, I think, that are going to ride the road bike
Yeah.
because it climbs. In
Hmm.
their theory, is it climbs better.
Right, right.
So off of this paper, what do you think?
Well,
Should
that was one of the things I liked about it is it talked about a more forward position. It was advantageous for climbing, and triathlon bikes have a more forward position than a road bike.
yeah. So I think we can dispel this myth that a hilly course
Yeah,
should be on a road bike.
right.
Um, you know, maybe if it was and the only one I can think of is the Alpe d'Huez triathlon,
Hmm.
where you
Yeah.
actually finish on the top of Alpe d'Huez.
Hmm.
Um, because I think that the tri bike, especially on the flats and then the downhills, is so much faster,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? I think of St. George as, when we did the Ironman in St. George, it was 7,000 feet of climbing,
Yeah. Right.
but the sections that were downhill and were flat are so fast,
Hmm.
that the aerodynamic advantage is so great. Because
Yeah.
to me, the only downside of the tri bike really in climbing is it's heavier.
Well, I think that and the options for hand positions are less. So if depending on how your base bar is built,
Yeah.
but I think those are the two things: is the weight and the options for where you can put your hand. So
But the weight, and the weight, maybe it's, I don't know, like the difference in your road bike and your time trial
hmm.
bike. Mine's about 4 pounds,
Yeah.
but that's with all the gadgets.
Hmm. Yeah. True. Right.
And but then I guess I put all the gadgetry on my road bike. If I'm going to do an Ironman on my road bike, it's going to have some bags on it
Yeah.
and two
Right.
water
Right.
bottles, and
That's right.
it's going to be heavy anyways.
Yeah. That's right.
So it's not like it's going to be that 12, 12 pound or whatever, 12 kilogram, 12 pound bike.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it'll be interesting. I wonder if someone will do a bike count there, and put those numbers out there in terms of how many
Um,
bikes or
I
road.
bet they will. I
Yeah,
bet they will.
yeah.
But what you got to look at is what I'd rather see is like in the age groupers, you take the top 10
Hmm.
finishers and
Yeah.
how many of them chose a road bike versus a triathlon bike,
Hmm.
right? And even the pros, I don't think you're going to see very many pros on a road bike.
Yeah. Well, who was it who won 70.3 Nice a few years? Was it Gustav?
Yeah.
He
Yeah.
did on the road bike.
But remember, that was one of his very first races coming out of ITU racing.
Yeah, that's right. And he didn't have a tri bike, so it wasn't like
Right.
he was choosing one over the other.
Yeah. And
So,
Taylor Nibb, when she did so well in St. George, when she was the first year and she was on a road bike, she didn't own a time trial bike,
yeah, yeah.
right? And if you come from that world of you've only been ITU racing, and so where
Yeah.
you're on a road bike,
Hmm.
I probably would do the same. Like, this is my comfort zone. This is
Oh,
the
that's
bike I do everything on. I'm not going to go into a new bike
right.
a, for one race or for,
Hmm.
so I
Hmm.
think that's the difference.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Oh, I love it. Yeah, it would be fun to see what the equipment count is. How
Exactly.
many people left their disc wheels behind or what have you. So it'll be fun.
Awesome. All
Yeah,
right, John. Hey, well, that was great. Thanks
yeah,
for sharing another Friday night with me. Back at it this fall.
yeah.
We're gonna knock out a bunch of these and have some fun with them.
That's great. All right. Hey, have a good weekend.
Yeah, you too. Take care.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.